President Trump has been very clear and consistent. He's prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice. The Maduro regime is not the legitimate government of Venezuela. It is a narco-terror cartel. In Maduro, it is the view of this administration, is not a legitimate president.
The Caribbean Sea, late afternoon, just north of Venezuela. 3 U.S. Navy destroyers of the Arleigh Burke class rode heavy swells, their radars alive with echoes that meant more than weather. They were here not to fire, but to watch, to shadow, to apply pressure without crossing the line that could ignite war. The air was thick with humidity, blurring horizons, while Venezuelan coastal radars swept farther than usual. Every shift in bearing, every knot of speed from the American ships was read in Caracas as a message. This was deterrence in its most dangerous form, close enough to see, close enough to threaten, but always one breath away from combat. The first signs came quietly. On the radar scopes, small blips appeared at the edge of detection. They moved fast, low on the water, and straight toward the U.S. formation. These were no fishing boats. Analysts confirmed them as Venezuelan fast attack craft, each capable of launching anti-ship missiles designed to overwhelm larger warships through swarm tactics. The American destroyers held course, their navigation lights visible against the darkening sky, a deliberate show of presence. But below decks, weapons crews moved to readiness. The Aegis combat system tracked each contact, assigning threat levels. Above, a Seahawk helicopter clawed into the night, its sensors sweeping for confirmation. And still, the swarm advanced, silent but deliberate. What was unfolding was bigger than a standoff at sea. For Washington, the mission was clear: monitor Venezuelan missile batteries ashore, prevent them from threatening regional sea lanes, and show that escalation would not be tolerated. For Caracas, the sight of 3 American destroyers hovering just outside territorial waters was provocation itself, a challenge to sovereignty and pride. Each mile closed by the fast boats shortened the Americans' reaction time. Each radar sweep from land hinted at heavier weapons waiting in reserve. The U.S. captains knew the rules of engagement demanded restraint. No fire unless fired upon. The Venezuelan commanders seemed to understand that too, pressing their boats to the edge of confrontation, daring the destroyers to blink first. And then, the moment came. A plume of fire erupted from the Venezuelan formation. Sensors confirmed it instantly. An anti-ship missile streaking skyward, leveling toward the American warships. What followed would push modern naval defenses to their limit. This is the true story of what happened next. The first sign of tension came not with a shot fired, but with the faint return of radar echoes on the Combat Information Center screens. 3 United States Navy destroyers, each a guided missile warship of the Arleigh Burke class, had taken up positions in international waters just north of Venezuela. Their mission was to shadow, to watch, to apply pressure without breaking the line that would trigger a direct clash. The sea was heavy, rolling with swells that interfered with radar horizons, while the humid Caribbean air blurred visual ranges. Electronic chatter filled the spectrum as Venezuelan coastal defense radars began sweeping more aggressively, their search beams reaching further than usual. The U.S. commanders aboard each ship knew that surveillance was not passive here. Every movement, every bearing change, every shift of speed would be read in Caracas as a message. Their immediate objective was simple to state, but dangerous to execute. Hold position, keep eyes locked on Venezuelan missile batteries ashore, and be ready to react if the situation turned hot. Inside the control rooms, the Aegis combat system tracked the radar signatures with mechanical calm. Each track was labeled, evaluated, and logged as either surface, air, or coastal emitter. Watchstanders identified Venezuelan patrol craft moving southward out of Puerto Cabello, their silhouettes faint against the late afternoon haze. The destroyer's SPY-1 phased array radars, capable of monitoring hundreds of contacts simultaneously, were now tasked with painting a picture of every potential threat within a wide arc of sea and airspace. Reports streamed back to the Fleet Command, each noting not just the presence of Venezuelan vessels, but their formation, speeds, and headings. The destroyers did not yet arm missiles, but the vertical launch cells beneath their decks waited in silence, each holding standard missile interceptors or Tomahawk cruise missiles depending on loadout. To the crew, this was the kind of tension that never eased, the knowledge that seconds might separate quiet observation from life or death action. Orders were clear: do not provoke, but do not be caught unprepared. The outcome of this first contact was not measured in explosions or wreckage, but in the psychological pressure building on both sides. For the Venezuelan operators manning their shore-based radars, the sight of 3 American destroyers holding steady just outside their territorial waters was unmistakably aggressive. For the U.S. crews, every radar sweep and encrypted transmission hinted at a test of nerves, a contest of endurance that could suddenly transform into open combat. Shadows lengthened across the sea as daylight began to fade, and with nightfall approaching, the tactical picture grew more complex. The destroyer's infrared sensors were tuned for after-dark tracking, but Venezuelan fast attack craft could exploit the cover of darkness and the clutter of coastal waters. What had started as distant radar traces was now an uneasy standoff, a waiting game in which silence was as dangerous as gunfire. And then, just as the destroyers settled into their night watches, a new set of contacts began to appear on the edge of the radar scope, moving faster than patrol boats and headed directly into the surveillance zone. As night settled over the Caribbean, the situation shifted from quiet observation to active confrontation. The radar screens aboard the U.S. destroyers began filling with tracks that did not resemble standard coastal patrol patterns. These were smaller, faster signatures, hugging the surface of the water, closing distance with deliberate speed. Analysts quickly identified them as fast attack craft operated by the Venezuelan Navy, armed with short-range anti-ship missiles and capable of harassing larger vessels by swarming in numbers. The destroyers maintained their station, their navigation lights visible against the dark horizon, a calculated decision to show presence without escalating. But as the range closed, the atmosphere on the combat decks changed from routine vigilance to a state of combat readiness. Every operator knew that a miscalculation now could turn into the first exchange of fire. The Aegis combat system continuously updated tracks, assigning priority levels to those fast attack craft that pressed furthest toward the surveillance zone. Commands rippled through the ships, moving crew to their battle stations, close-in weapon systems. Those rapid-firing rotary cannons designed to shred incoming missiles rotated slowly into alignment, their sensors locked onto the sea-skimming signatures. Electronic warfare officers began flooding the spectrum with countermeasures, attempting to disrupt the targeting radars carried on the Venezuelan boats. Overhead, an MH-60R Seahawk helicopter lifted off from one of the destroyers, its infrared system sweeping the sea for visual confirmation. The roar of its rotors cut through the night, signaling to both friend and potential foe that the Americans were ready to respond. The Venezuelan craft responded with their own signals, their navigation lights extinguished, their radar emissions intermittent, a tactic designed to complicate tracking. It was not a missile launch yet, but it was an unmistakable act of aggression. A probing move meant to test American resolve. The first outcome of this maneuver was psychological pressure against the American crews, forced to hold fire as the enemy drew ever closer. Rules of engagement demanded that they wait for a hostile act before initiating a strike, and the Venezuelan commanders appeared to understand this, pressing forward to the edge of provocation without crossing the line. Still, every mile gained by those fast boats meant less reaction time if a missile suddenly left its launcher. The Seahawk's crew reported multiple infrared flares along the waterline of the Venezuelan formation, the telltale exhausts of missile tubes being uncovered. That report was relayed instantly back to the destroyer captains, who in turn authorized weapon systems to full readiness. The sea was now alive with tension, radar beams and countermeasures bouncing across the spectrum, engines roaring against the swell, gunners gripping their controls in silence. And then the calm broke, not with a warning, but with the unmistakable heat signature of a missile leaving its tube, streaking skyward before leveling toward the American formation. The launch of the missile from the Venezuelan fast attack craft forced the American destroyers to shift instantly from shadowing operations to active defense. Combat alarms echoed through steel corridors, crewmen sealed hatches, and the combat information centers became a hive of controlled urgency. The Aegis system automatically classified the inbound missile, calculating speed, bearing, and projected impact point. It was a sea-skimming threat designed to fly low over the waves to evade radar detection, but the SPY-1 phased array radar maintained a firm lock. Within seconds, the decision process moved from command to weapon, and the destroyer closest to the threat initiated its vertical launch system, sending a Standard missile interceptor streaking into the night. The horizon lit with a flare as the weapon ignited, climbing sharply before angling down toward the hostile track. Every sailor in the operations room held their breath, knowing that in modern naval combat, the difference between interception and impact is often measured in milliseconds. The first interceptor detonated near the incoming missile, its fragmentation warhead scattering a lethal cloud of shrapnel across the flight path. Sensors confirmed a break in the missile's trajectory, but the threat was not completely neutralized. A second inbound signature appeared almost immediately, fired from another Venezuelan vessel in the formation. The destroyer's close-in weapon system, a radar-guided Gatling cannon known simply as CIWS, roared to life. Its barrels spun at blinding speed, spitting a stream of tungsten rounds into the darkness, each one designed to shred metal and circuitry before the warhead could reach its target. Tracer fire streaked across the Black Sea, and moments later the second missile disintegrated in a burst of flame and debris. At the same time, electronic warfare officers deployed jamming bursts across the electromagnetic spectrum, disrupting targeting signals and feeding false echoes to the enemy's systems. Overhead, the Seahawk helicopter marked the coordinates of the Venezuelan boats, transmitting continuous updates that allowed the destroyers to keep weapons trained on the attackers without hesitation. The immediate result was survival, but the exchange revealed that the confrontation had escalated far beyond shadowing maneuvers. The Venezuelan Navy had fired live ordnance at American warships, and the U.S. crews had responded with layered defense, long-range interceptors, close-in cannons, and electronic suppression, all working in unison. Yet the sea was not clear of danger. Radar operators reported additional contacts emerging from the coastline, more fast attack craft leaving their harbors at high speed. The destroyers had proven their ability to survive the first strike, but they now faced the possibility of saturation tactics, where numbers could overwhelm even the most advanced defenses. The crews knew that the next minutes could decide whether this remained an exchange of warning shots or turned into a full-scale naval battle. As they reloaded missile cells, recalibrated jammers, and prepared for another wave, the combat decks fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the constant hum of machinery. And then, just as calm seemed to return, the SPY-1 radar detected multiple launch signatures along the Venezuelan coastline, not from small boats this time, but from shore-based batteries with far greater range and destructive power. The sudden appearance of multiple launch signatures from the Venezuelan coast marked a dangerous new phase in the confrontation. Unlike the small, anti-ship missiles carried by fast boats, these were shore-based weapons with far greater range and striking power. Their trajectories were quickly identified by the Aegis system as coming from mobile coastal batteries, platforms designed to protect national waters by denying access to hostile fleets. Within seconds, the destroyers found themselves staring at the possibility of a coordinated strike that could overwhelm even layered defenses. The Caribbean night, that had seemed tense but manageable only minutes earlier, now vibrated with the energy of a true escalation, the kind of shift that moved a standoff into open war. Commanders aboard each ship relayed urgent updates to higher command, knowing that authorization for wider rules of engagement might soon be necessary. The incoming missiles were detected in pairs, their heat signatures rising above the coastline before dipping towards sea-skimming altitude to avoid radar interception. Combat teams responded with a precision drilled countless times, but never casual in execution. Standard missile interceptors left their launch cells in rapid succession, each one climbing into the sky before adjusting to meet the descending threats. Radar screens lit with crossing lines as tracking data fed continuously into the fire control system, calculating interception points with relentless speed. The destroyers maneuvered to present narrower target profiles, engines surging against the swell as officers issued sharp helm corrections. Electronic warfare operators expanded their jamming patterns, hoping to blind enemy seekers or cause them to lock onto decoys. From the deck, sailors could hear the deep, reverberating thunder of missile launches echoing back from the Venezuelan coast, a reminder that the engagement was now against a national defense system rather than isolated patrol patrol craft. Above, the Seahawk helicopter transmitted a steady stream of imagery confirming mobile launchers hidden among coastal terrain, evidence that the Venezuelan forces had escalated deliberately, bringing their heaviest weapons to bear. The first wave of interception succeeded, but not without strain. One missile was destroyed by a direct hit from an SM-2 interceptor. Another was shredded by a CIWS burst as it closed within striking distance, while a third was diverted only at the last moment by aggressive jamming. The destroyers had survived, but the crews understood that survival was now a temporary condition rather than a guarantee. More launch signatures appeared on radar, some further inland, suggesting that Venezuela was deploying not just coastal batteries, but possibly longer-range systems positioned for maximum effect. The tactical picture was shifting rapidly, and commanders had to consider whether holding position remained viable. Each missile forced the use of precious interceptors, and the supply of defensive munitions was not unlimited. If saturation continued, the fleet risked depletion at a critical moment. The combat decks buzzed with reports, weapons crews reloaded under pressure, and command officers weighed their options. And then, as the Aegis system tracked yet another wave of launches, analysts identified a new and more troubling signal, one consistent not with a subsonic anti-ship missile, but with a faster, heavier design approaching speeds that strained reaction times. The detection of faster and heavier missile signatures from the Venezuelan coastline was the moment the engagement reached its most perilous stage. These were not simple subsonic sea skimmers, but weapons designed for greater speed and destructive impact, possibly capable of penetrating even advanced defenses if fired in sufficient numbers. Inside the combat information centers, the mood was taut. Every operator working at the edge of concentration as the Aegis system tracked the incoming wave. The destroyers had already expended a significant number of interceptors, and commanders knew that another saturation attack could not be endured indefinitely. Yet retreat was not an option. To turn the tide, the U.S. formation needed to seize the initiative, not merely react. Orders were issued to bring offensive systems online, targeting not just the incoming missiles, but the coastal batteries themselves. The destroyers launched a coordinated counterstrike. From vertical launch cells, Tomahawk cruise missiles roared skyward before dipping low, programmed to strike the mobile launchers identified by the Seahawk helicopter. At the same time, additional SM-2 interceptors leapt from the ships, crossing paths with the inbound threats in arcs of flame and contrails. The combat decks shook with the rapid sequence of launches, while the night sky lit with successive flashes as interceptors found their marks. Electronic warfare teams blanketed the spectrum with noise, attempting to split the coordination of the Venezuelan batteries, while decoys deployed from the destroyer's launchers confused enemy guidance systems. The Seahawk provided constant targeting updates, relaying infrared imagery of Venezuelan launch vehicles repositioning among hills and coastal terrain. Each image translated into strike coordinates, uploaded into the guidance systems of outbound Tomahawks. In minutes, the American warships had shifted from pure defense to layered offense, their weapons hunting the sources of the threat rather than simply waiting for the next wave. The results became clear in rapid succession. Two of the heavy missiles were intercepted at range, detonating harmlessly over the water. A third was shredded by the CIWS in a deafening burst of tungsten fire that shook the deck. One slipped closer than expected, but aggressive jamming diverted its seeker head away from the formation, sending it splashing into the sea. Meanwhile, the first Tomahawks reached their targets ashore. Explosions rumbled across the coastline as the precision-guided weapons struck Venezuelan launch sites, silencing at least part of the barrage. The combination of interception, close-in defense, electronic warfare, and retaliatory strikes forced the enemy to break rhythm. What had seemed an inexhaustible stream of launches suddenly faltered, gaps opening in the attack cycle as Venezuelan crews scrambled to relocate or protect their surviving batteries. The destroyer's crews, drenched in sweat and adrenaline, understood that the balance had shifted. They had not only survived, but disrupted the enemy's offensive momentum. Yet victory was not secure. Radar operators still tracked scattered fast attack craft, regrouping offshore, and intelligence feeds warned of potential secondary launches from deeper inland. The tide was turning, but the battle was far from over, and every sailor knew that the next engagement would decide whether the night ended with survival or disaster. The U.S. destroyers had weathered the heaviest strikes, their counteroffensive disrupting the coastal batteries and forcing Venezuelan forces to lose tempo. Yet the confrontation was not over. As radar screens cleared of the immediate missile wave, new contacts began to emerge on the periphery of the surveillance zone. These were not heavy missiles or coastal launchers, but clusters of fast attack craft regrouping offshore, supported by smaller aerial drones launched from the Venezuelan mainland. The threat was secondary, but it was no less dangerous. A swarm of small craft combined with airborne drones providing targeting data could still penetrate defenses through sheer complexity. For the American commanders, the priority shifted from survival to elimination, ensuring that no lingering threats could shadow the formation once daylight returned. The destroyers prepared for a final sweep, coordinating air, surface, and electronic assets for a decisive close-range engagement. The Aegis combat system cataloged the new swarm, assigning tracks to every vessel and drone. MH-60R Seahawks were vectored toward the fast boats, each armed with precision-guided Hellfire missiles optimized for small, fast-moving targets. On the destroyers themselves, deck guns were brought into play, their fire control radars locking onto the closest contacts. At the same time, electronic warfare teams expanded jamming operations to sever links between drones and their controllers ashore, stripping the fast boats of their targeting support. The battle unfolded as a multi-layered strike. Seahawks swept low over the waves, launching Hellfires that streaked toward the Venezuelan boats, detonating in bursts of fire that shattered hulls and scattered formations. The destroyers opened up with 5-inch naval guns, their thunder rolling across the sea as shells ripped into remaining targets. CIWS systems tracked and destroyed aerial drones that attempted to close the distance, filling the sky with bursts of tungsten and smoke. Every layer of defense, from missile interceptors to small caliber guns, was brought into play, not for survival this time, but for decisive control of the battle space. The outcome was brutal and final. Within minutes, the Venezuelan fast attack craft were either destroyed or retreating at high speed, their formations broken and their communication disrupted. Drone signals faded as jamming cut through remaining control links, leaving them to crash harmlessly into the sea. The destroyers held their positions, sensors sweeping for any last traces of hostile movement. The silence that followed was stark, broken only by the low rumble of engines and the distant crackle of radios reporting secured sectors. The secondary threat had been neutralized, but the price of endurance was evident in the exhausted faces of the crews and the empty slots in the missile launch cells. The U.S. warships had not sought battle, but when pressed, they had dismantled every layer of Venezuelan escalation. As dawn approached over the Caribbean, the horizon was quiet once again. Yet even in victory, no one aboard believed the danger had passed entirely. For just as the last echoes of combat faded, intelligence officers reported indications of Venezuelan aircraft preparing for possible sorties inland. The battle at sea had been won, but the confrontation was still evolving, and the next phase might come from the skies. The confrontation off the Venezuelan coast ended without the loss of an American warship, but the cost of survival was visible in every deck, every crew member, and every depleted missile cell. What had begun as a deliberate act of pressure, 3 destroyers shadowing a contested coastline, had transformed into a full-scale engagement of missiles, drones, and fast attack craft. It was a reminder that modern naval operations, even those framed as deterrents, can cross into combat with almost no warning. Seconds separated passive observation from a battle in which survival hinged on flawless execution. For the crews, the experience was a test of endurance under relentless pressure. Radar operators fought fatigue as they tracked wave after wave of incoming signatures. Electronic warfare teams strained to suppress hostile targeting, and weapons crews reloaded under the knowledge that any mistake would cost lives. The layered defense worked as designed, long-range interceptors striking at distance, close-in systems shredding missiles at the edge of impact, helicopters hunting boats and feeding targeting data. Yet every defensive success was also a warning. The saturation tactics employed by Venezuelan forces nearly overwhelmed some of the most advanced systems afloat. That reality will shape tactical planning for years to come. The strategic implications extend well beyond the Caribbean. For the United States, the operation underscored the risks of extended presence near adversary shores, where geography favors defenders armed with coastal missile batteries and swarming craft. For Venezuela, the clash highlighted the limits of escalation, as even a determined strike failed to push back a technologically superior fleet. But for the global maritime community, the incident carried a broader lesson. Sea lanes and contested zones remain one miscalculation away from disaster. As hypersonic weapons, drone swarms, and electronic warfare continue to evolve, the margin for error will only narrow further. In the end, the destroyers emerged intact, their crews exhausted but alive, their mission complete. They had shadowed, endured, and turned the tide of battle without escalating into a full regional war. Yet the quiet that followed was uneasy, because every sailor aboard knew the confrontation had not solved the underlying tension. It had only revealed how quickly it could ignite. If you believe stories like this matter, and that we must understand modern war before it happens again, subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel.